What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 125, and I'm the co-host Kyle Anslone, joined by the co-host Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Kyle, how you doing tonight?
Doing very well. Will, we have a full show, a lot of topics to get into, and I think that, the most important thing being the talking about repealing an authorization for use of military force and pretending like that's a big deal, and we're going to explain why this really isn't rolling back the terror war at all. A lot of important stuff on today's show. Be sure to share it. Video versions at YouTube and Odyssey. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. You can follow us on social media. We have accounts on Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter, with the Twitter handle being at con_interest. You can also support the show by donating. We take donations at Subscribestar and Patreon. There's also the links to our addresses for Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash in the show notes page. And then you could support the show by supporting our sponsor and getting some great CBD products over at Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com, and you use the promo code PEACE when you check out. You spend $75 or more, that gets you 25% off. And, well, I really like their topicals, especially their sports cream. I gotta say, I've been traveling the past couple days, and
Yeah.
I really like the size of the sports cream I got, but unfortunately I can't travel with it because of the stupid TSA rules. So
Right, put a
I
high
had to
bomb
leave
in
it
there.
at home, and I could feel it this morning. I went, and I was like, man, I could really use some of it, and I didn't have it with me. So I'm missing it, and when I'm back home in a couple days, I'll enjoy having it again in the mornings. But, Will, what do you like from Paloma Verde?
Yeah, well, there's two things there I think I really like. There's the high dose, just like oil tincture. That's the best, just to get the slam dunk dose of CBD. But also they have these melatonin soft gels that I really like. And I actually just recently got the new formulation in the mail from Carlos, and I cannot wait to try those. So I would definitely recommend other people also try them. So yeah, definitely check that out at the great website palomaverdecbd.com. You can get lab results and all kinds of educational info. And yes, do use the promo code PEACE to get 25% off your order. Um, so yeah, just to jump into our first story here, I wanted to start with one that's on a really important topic we've covered pretty consistently, I think, on this show, and that is the war authorizations, or what they call authorizations for the use of military force, or AUMFs. And there are a handful of these still on the books, including one that goes back to the 1950s that was, passed to fight international communism. So there's quite a few of these still on the books, still legally valid. There's one from 91, there's one from 2001, there's one from 2002. And there are some efforts right now in Congress to repeal some of these things. And one of these bills actually recently just passed the House. And so tell us about that. What AUMF is this for, and what does this bill do?
Yeah, so this is mainly for the 2002, although I think the Senate version of this bill is trying to roll the 1991 into it too. And these
Yeah.
are the U.S. war authorizations to fight against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And so, obviously, being in the year 2021, you would need a time machine to think that this bill has, any legitimacy at all, or these authorizations have any legitimacy at all. And yet, in a way, they can kind of be used from time to time. I think Obama voted the 2002. I think there was speculation that Trump was going to use the 2002 or the 1991 to carry out the strike against Soleimani in Iraq, because the bill is somewhat vague, where they did interpret it as basically, we now have an authorization to take out anyone in Iraq who could ever be interpreted as a threat, is kind of how some people have phrased that bill. So
Right.
because of that, it's not completely a showpiece, but anybody who pays attention to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East knows that a lot of it just goes on without any authorization at all. But to the extent that they have authorization or cited in legislation a war authorization, it's the 2001 authorization for use of military force, which it was kind of, it wasn't that vague. Well, it did say to go after Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and somehow that's been stretched to go after what they say is Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in Burkina Faso, or Al Shabaab in Somalia. That seems really far from Afghanistan to me, but that's the one that they really use. So I think this is really a showpiece to go after the 2002, and that's what's happening here. Now, it did pass the House House, and the effort was led by Barbara Lee, who has been good on all this stuff the whole time. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the things that, makes me say it's worth it to support it, is that Barbara Lee is putting her time and effort into it. And she puts her time and effort to battle the war state on Capitol Hill. And so if that's what, she's doing. Now, I think the risk is, we've heard a lot of chatter about this, that we could repeal it, but only if we're going to replace it. And so right now we have two outdated laws on the books. And like I said, they could be dusted off to do something from drone strike from time to time, something like that. But at the same time, I think Americans see it as quite a stretch to use that for, another major offensive in Iraq. I think they would probably use the 2001 if, an Al-Qaeda threat start to emerge, or they really need an excuse to go back in. And so I think it could be dangerous if we repeal this and then replace it with something that was passed in 2021, alone being, an AUMF that's not over 18 years old is, going to be somewhat valuable, right? Just to have the 2021 date next to it. So I think there's a lot of risk to this, that, the Hawks like Cheney are going to replace it. But I thought it was also worth it to add, Will, before I let you open up, that again, the debate on Capitol Hill is completely missing the point, right? Like the people who are advocating for this, some of them, like the Tim Kaine, Chuck Schumer types, are making this sound like it's a blow to the war on terror. And it's not. This isn't a blow to endless war. It's not a blow to the U.S. military state. It's like an auxiliary small thing that they could use in a small area of the, their global war on terror. There's maybe some small use for it, but it's really not that big of a thing. But again, especially if you're letting like a Chuck Schumer type lead the charge on this, this bill gets in conference committee, Camille. We could have conference committee, Will, and we could have a real Frankenstein monster coming out here where, they're saying that, oh, we have a new authorization to fight any threat in Iraq, and suddenly they're pointing at the Shia militias and trying to, start a new war against Iran and Iraq. I mean, that's really the kind of thing that could come out of this. So this is a show thing that's happening for the most part on Capitol Hill, and we have to stay aware of it. And if it just gets repealed, that's better than staying on the books, but it really doesn't do that much. Will, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so first of all, I absolutely agree that like the 2001 AUMF is really the one with teeth. That's the one that, it's the broadest one that can really justify the interventions everywhere. I think that's the one we cite to have troops deployed in Kenya because they're fighting the, Al-Shabaab next door in Somalia, and that is apparently an associated force of Al-Qaeda. So like, that's the one that can justify military action virtually anywhere, whenever, they can make any tortured argument to justify that. However, for the repeal of the 2002 one, the Iraq one, I have seen the White House saying that like they have signaled they will sign this if this makes it to Biden's desk. However, I've also seen that like in the Senate, the Republicans are going to try to fight this a little more. However, off air, you were saying that there is some indication that it might pass the Senate too. That Schumer is confident about that. So can you tell us anything about that?
Well, I mean, I was just kind of doing my own thought little experiment of the situation where there are like Joe Manchin may go against this. He has what he sees as a pretty like conservative base, and I'm guessing his interpretation of his conservative voters is they're pro George Bush, pro Iraq war, and so he may stand against this, or may couch his, oh, I'm only going to support it if there's a replacement for it. But again, this was pushed by Tim Kaine, who was Hillary Clinton's running mate. It doesn't get much more mainstream than that. Chuck Schumer saying that he thinks it's going to pass, and at the end of the day, I do think it's better to pass this bill again, just the repeal of the 2002, than it is to leave it on the books. And so I'm guessing that we'll see like Rand Paul, and then even maybe not Ted Cruz, maybe Ted Cruz. I would guess Mike Lee. There's several other Republicans in the Senate that I could see going either way on this bill, and deciding to repeal it, especially since Biden is president. It's the same kind of phenomenon still as the start of the Trump administration, where they're saying Trump is a puppet of Vladimir Putin, but we're going to spend your secret war list spying powers, right? Like there is some of that goes on, but at the same time, some Republicans are also like, no, I'm not going to authorize Joe Biden to have more war. I'm going to, repeal all the extra war powers that he has. So, kind of from a constitutional perspective, I think there's a lot of fertile ground for Republicans to come to the right position on this issue, especially when it, at the end of the day, the military industrial complex, maybe they would rather leave it on the books. Well, but I don't think that they're seeing this as like a major casualty in their fight for more funding.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else on this, Will? We will continue to update it if it does get to Biden's desk. And again,
Yep.
if there is like some kind of conference committee, that's where you really have to worry about them coming out with some kind of freak bill that has, a reauthorization or something. I saw that's what Liz Cheney is calling for and whining about. We have to replace it with
No,
something. We can't just repeal this
that's
war on a
horrible.
country where, we've been in control of the government for over a decade. But Will, we should move on and talk about Gaza, which I didn't think would be quite a news story so soon. I thought they would probably wait a couple of weeks before they start bombing Gaza after the latest ceasefire, but nope,
Yeah.
the bombs are already falling. So tell us what's happening.
Yeah, sure. So, our long-term listeners will know we devoted a lot of coverage, a lot of detailed coverage to this big flare-up in Gaza last month. And I think one of the last things we had talked about, we kind of left it at the ceasefire deal that ended the last round of fighting, which I think killed like more than 250 Palestinians and I think 13 in Israel. Well, that ceasefire that we covered last time, it has nearly imploded last week. Or I guess you could say it did implode because the Israelis did carry out a couple rounds of airstrikes in Gaza. And this is mostly related to this flag march event that was put on by Israeli nationalist groups last week, where they do this big parade through Jerusalem to celebrate Israel's victory in the Six-Day War in 1967, when they captured and occupied East Jerusalem, the Arab Palestinian half of that city. And this march was originally supposed to happen last month, actually, but it was postponed because of the fighting in Gaza. I think the Israeli authorities just decided like this is too dangerous to attempt it at that point. It would have inflamed the situation too much if they tried to have these right wing Israeli groups march through East Jerusalem at that point. It just would have been too much. Um, and so they did end up holding it last week. And they actually diverted the path of the parade through Jerusalem to be a little bit less provocative. They had it like bypass a certain area where a lot of Arabs often gather, like a social gathering spot. But nonetheless, this still led to a bunch of clashes with Palestinians. There were some injuries and some arrests. It's a fairly typical occurrence in some of the occupied territories where there's these kind of clashes. However, in retaliation for that, Palestinians in Gaza started sending over these incendiary balloons, which we've talked about these in the show a lot. They're these crappy homemade weapons that are mostly harmless. They sometimes set farmland on fire, sometimes they damage property, but almost always they're not actually hurting anybody. Nonetheless, though, I mean, not hurting anyone bodily. Like, obviously, damage to your property is still harm, but I just mean they're not killing people typically. However, the Israeli military cites the balloons as reason to start bombing things in Gaza. And so that's what we saw on, I think, Wednesday and Thursday night. And the IDF, as always, says that they're hitting terrorist Hamas targets, but it's not usually totally clear what they're actually hitting. They're bombing these like densely populated civilian areas. They can point to any building and say this is a Hamas target, but it's usually not very clear that that is the case. And this actually went on for 2 nights in a row. There was the balloons and then the airstrikes in response. However, some interesting thing that I had seen, it looks like they're already starting to sort this out. Like there were some reports today, Sunday, that there's been some talks to de-escalate. And I had even seen the Israelis have scaled back a couple aspects of the Gaza blockade, that they're apparently allowing mail now into the Gaza Strip, and they're letting Gazans leave to get medical treatment. Both of those things had previously been blocked since the fighting last month, but apparently they've loosened those things up. And the last thing I'll say here is like we should recall this is all happening under a new Israeli government. Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer in charge there, and the new guy Naftali Bennett, he is himself quite a right-wing hawk, in his own right. But the new coalition is made up of all over the Israeli political spectrum. There are sort of centrist liberal groups. There's even some Arab parties involved. So I don't know if this thing with the mail and the medical treatment, I don't know if those are signs that they're going to be a little more willing to make concessions in the future, or if that's just kind of a coincidence or a fluke or something. But I am very interested to see how this new government kind of approaches this. Like clearly they're perfectly fine to bomb Gaza. They've already done it. But I just wonder if we'll be able to tell any difference with this new administration.
Right. Yeah, and well, I think just to highlight the point that this is, balloons with something on fire tied to them, right? Sailing over the border. Of course, it could destroy some property. But
Right.
then Israel's responding by, again, bombing densely populated areas, high potential to kill people that had absolutely no involvement whatsoever. And so the Israeli bombing campaign is just collective punishment on the Palestinians, the poor prisoners who live in the Gaza concentration camp. Is
Right.
essentially the situation. I didn't have anything else on the bombing. Well, you really hit on all the details that I had been aware of. I did want to point out that the Palestinian Authority is complaining that their vaccination drive that they have with the Israelis isn't going so well, and that is due to a refusal, or on the Israeli part, they feel like the vaccines are coming with like too close of an expiration date to the day they're getting them, and so they're not able to make use of them. I guess by
Right.
the time they get them, figure out where they're sending them to, it's too late. So at least that's a complaint that the Palestinian Authority is putting forward. And look, it's good propaganda on the Israelis' behalf to say, look, we're giving vaccines to these people. Well, that may not be as kind of as gesture as it seems. Maybe they're
Right.
just unloading some old supply or something like that. It's like the grocery store that gives away the meat that's too old to sell to its regular customers to a food pantry. It kind of works
Right.
out well for them too. It doesn't take up space in their dumpster like that. That has to be recognized, that like it works well on both ends if you're giving away products that aren't what you're going to use for your own people. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Will, anything else on Gaza?
No, that's about all I had. I certainly hope that this little flare up is the last we'll see of that. I know there are efforts right now, some diplomatic efforts to de-escalate that, and it appears, at least I could be misinterpreting this, but it does look like the Israeli government has attempted some concessions here. So I don't know. I hope that is a sign that of good things to come, or better things to come at least.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess to jump into our next story here, we had an interesting one. We're actually going to mention Mark Milley a couple times today, but he had some very interesting comments. If you ever tune into these like House and Senate committee hearings, as I often do when I'm covering this stuff, you very quickly notice that American lawmakers and military officials are obsessed with China right now. It's all they talk about right now. It's just the challenges and the concerns and the pacing threat that China poses. You just constantly hear this. And usually people like General Mark Milley, who is the top uniformed officer in the Pentagon, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, typically Milley is one to hype the stuff up. And I think we did kind of hear some of that from him this week too. But there was also a committee hearing where he was very uncharacteristically downplaying some of the hype and the hand wringing about China and Taiwan. So what did he say about that this last week?
Yeah, so one person I follow for that, Will, by the way, for people who don't want to sit down and watch the committee hearings, Idris Ali is the Reuters Pentagon reporter, and he does a
Yes.
pretty good job of, at the very least, just finding important statements made by the Pentagon and its spokespeople and bringing them to like public attention. I'm not saying like what his take is, if he's given his opinion is always right, but I am saying that when something like this is said, he understands that it's important enough to tweet out and why. And
Yeah.
so, again, this is the head of the Joint Chiefs. And he said that my assessment in terms of capability, I think China has a way to go to develop the actual no kidding capability to conduct military operations to seize through military means the entire island of Taiwan if they wanted to do that. And so, well, I thought there was actually like two or three positive like statements here. And the first one, that he doesn't think that China has the capability to seize Taiwan. Taiwan does have a pretty advanced military. We've sold them a lot of weapons by this point. And so, to be realistic and to understand, to invade an island, even if it is close to your coast, even if it is a major world power like China, and then an island with a smaller population, an advanced economy, an advanced military, but nonetheless smaller in size,
Right.
you could inflict a lot of pain on China. And to understand that dynamic and to like bring that to attention, I think is important, because he's not saying that China couldn't win a war against Taiwan. He's saying that China doesn't have the capability to seize the entire island through military means, right? And so
Right.
that those are kind of different things that he's pointing out. And if China can't like quickly take the whole island and have Taiwan and the government there inflict a massive amount of pain on China, they're not going to do it. And so that kind of, deterrence is important to understand. And so I was happy to see that. And then what it would mean to seize the entire island of Taiwan, I think, is also important. Look, you guys then control the population. The people of Taiwan don't want to be Chinese, or they don't want to be citizens of the Chinese Communist Party. Right? Maybe
Right.
they see themselves as citizens of China or Chinese people, but they certainly don't see themselves as citizens of the government that's currently based in Beijing. And so I think they've shown a willingness, to fight that government. Not that, there's like a ton of government spending or anything in Taiwan, but, the people there seem to like say they value their independence. And so the Chinese party understands that if they want to seize that island, it's gonna cost a lot of blood and treasure and counterinsurgency. And then the last part is he added if they wanted to do that, which I think is important that he added that, because it doesn't assume that that's China's main goal here. Yeah, China
Right.
says that their goal is to return Taiwan to their control. They see it as all part of one China. But at the same time, he seems to understand that what China is doing here isn't necessarily just planning to try to take that over one day. So, Will, I mean, anything on this? I guess the last part that I think that's worth adding is that in the beginning of the Trump administration, while all the fire and fury comments were going on with North Korea, there was a CIA assessment that Kim Jong Un wasn't crazy. That's what it said, and that he was a
Right.
reasonable guy. And after that, Trump tried, the Twitter rhetoric toned down, and it kind of went more from fire and fury to can we find diplomacy. And I'm
Right.
not saying that this is the same thing, but that these kind of high level assessments by the so-called men and women in charge and in uniform of this whole thing are important. And so this could be a good sign, especially when tensions with China are very high. And I think the Biden administration is assessing that a summit with the Xi government in China may not be the right thing right now because tensions are so high. And
Right.
certainly the Alaska summit at the beginning of the Biden administration didn't go well. It ended in arguments. The opening statements,
Started
excuse
in
me,
arguments.
started in
Yeah.
arguments. Yeah, both sides complained the other side was cheating and
That's
spent,
right.
10, 15 minutes bashing the other side's human rights records. Will, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's really important to highlight this kind of comment because it's so rare. Like most of the time, what you're going to hear from these officials is that, Taiwan is just like totally vulnerable and they're ripe for invasion from the Chinese. And actually, I forget if we'd even talked about it on the show, but just recently, Biden's nominee to oversee the U.S. Special Forces, Christopher Meyer, was suggesting that we should have commandos there training Taiwanese troops in to repel a Chinese invasion. So it's just taking it as a foregone conclusion that they'd want to do that and suggesting to do this very provocative thing of putting American boots there. And so that's, the thinking of some of the people in charge. And it is good to see that Milley, he's like I said, the top uniformed officer, not the top civilian leader, but the top actual like military brass in the Pentagon, to see him kind of like cautioning that, maybe China isn't imminently going to invade Taiwan and that, hold our horses a little bit. It is good to see that.
Yeah, no, it certainly. I know a lot of times if you end up like in the anti-war community, like having like personal debates with people about what maybe the intentions of the U.S. are, some people will say that everything with China is just for show to generate like funding for the military-industrial complex. I'm like,
Right.
even if that's the case, things could still really spiral out of control. But this is a sign that there are people who do understand the dynamics and how they're at play and what's actually going on. And people, like the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is an important person should the U.S. decide to go war with China. So this
Absolutely.
was this wasn't bad news. And again, I'm sure that Milley is going to say plenty to generate more military aid to Taiwan, increase U.S.
Right.
military ties to Taiwan, more need for the Pacific Defense Initiative, and all these other big funding spending things, because he's going to warn that maybe one day China is going to do this, but that he's looking at the current situation as it is and making this assessment, and then letting elected leaders know that this is his assessment
Yeah.
is better news. So, Will, anything on
Absolutely.
this? If not, I would like to ask you about this story that you wrote up this week that I think is interesting and more important than, and more, it should get more attention than mainstream media.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's get into that one.
Yeah, so this is again our chair of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, making a statement. But they say that there's nearly 2,000 weapons that the Army, or Pentagon in general, has lost track of since 2010, or in the 2010s this happened. So,
Yeah.
Will, what's going on with these weapons, and what are we talking about here? Are we talking about tanks and attack helicopters, or like dummy grenades that don't actually explode?
Yeah, so last week the Associated Press actually ran this like years long investigation they've been doing into these weapons that have gone missing from the military, and they found that nearly 2,000 small arms had been lost or stolen. And you were right, in the 2010s. So like we were talking about a very specific time period here. It's probably much higher if we're accounting from then until now, the present. But the AP, I think, is just going off what they could find in internal records that they obtained through FOIA requests, and they did it through like the four main branches of the military, the Army, Marines, Navy, and Air Force. I think they got records into all that. And of these 1,900 or 2,000 small arms, we are mostly talking about like pistols and rifles and shotguns that have disappeared. But there were also some more serious weapons like light machine guns and grenade launchers, things like you could really harm people with. And some of these weapons were actually later used in crimes too, like civilian shootings. I think the AP found that there were 8 crimes committed in total with these stolen military weapons that they had at least good evidence for. And I think some of them had even been involved in more than one crime. The M4 or M9 pistols, especially, had been caught up in crimes. Now, this AP report had gotten some attention, and you mentioned Milley had commented on this. Lawmakers have been asking some senior military leaders about this report during various hearings last week, and they have mostly been downplaying it. So before you had Milley, you had the Army Secretary, Christine Warmuth, who was asked about it during a Senate hearing. And she specifically was asked because the vast majority of these weapons disappeared from the Army specifically. 1,300, I think, out of the 1,900 went missing from the Army for some reason. I'm not sure what explains the disproportionate numbers there. But Warmuth says that she thinks that the number is actually probably smaller than was reported. And, she kind of just downplayed it all. And General Mark Milley, again, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he pretty much said the same thing. He said that he would look into this, but he thinks that the AP investigation overstated its case. Now, he didn't really get into specifics. He just kind of like, deflected and said, no, it's probably overstating it. Now, the Pentagon actually used to give regular reports to Congress on lost and stolen weapons. But at some point, that requirement lapsed and they had to stop. They stopped doing it. I'm not totally sure why that happened, but I assume somebody is still supposed to keep track of this, but it's not all compiled into these annual reports like it used to be. So this information, the data, is not quite at people's fingertips as it used to be. But I don't know, like I don't really find this so surprising in terms of like what we know about the military. Like we know that overseas, the U.S. military has had a very hard time keeping track and accounting for its weapons. Last year, actually, a Pentagon Inspector General report found that they had failed to properly account for $715 million in weapons and gear that was in Syria. And a lot of that was like found to have been stored insecurely, so people could have had access to it. And they're not keeping records for this stuff, so who knows how much of that just disappeared? Just random groups made off of it. I don't think anybody really knows for sure there. And we also know that a lot of weapons that have been doled out in these arm and train programs overseas have wound up in the hands of pretty bad people. They've not kept very good track of that. Like jihadist groups in Syria have gotten a hold of a lot of this. And this is not only something that, our kooky fringe anti-war people have found, but you can find New York Times reporting on this about how a good proportion of those weapons were going to jihadist fighters. And there's weapons that we sell to the Saudis in Yemen that make their way into jihadist hands. And so I just think this all is like, this doesn't surprise me, this AP report, that we've, been so bad at keeping track of these weapons. We've known that for a while now with, the arm and train programs and the weapon sales overseas, that they don't really do a whole lot of due diligence to track these things. And, the last thing I'll say here is like, I'm a pro gun guy. Like, I'm not saying that, a few more pistols on the streets is like such a nightmare that it's going to, destroy our society or something. But I think it is kind of a problem when they can't keep track of this. They don't know where this stuff's going. And when we're finding later this stuff is used in real violent crimes like shootings, like that's a problem. And so I'm not going to, panic about there being a few more guns in the streets. But I do think it's a problem when the military can't even begin to keep track of this stuff.
Right. Well, one thing I'll add is I did read one article that pointed out that one of the reasons they felt like the number was higher in the Army is just because there's so much more Army personnel that's issued
Right.
standard. Just as standard issue, they get rifles and sidearms and stuff like that. I guess the Air Force doesn't do it as much, and then the
Right.
other branches aren't as big. And so somebody pointed that out to me. I don't know how true that is, but it seemed like it was a possibility to be correct.
That sounds plausible for
Yeah,
sure.
and then yeah, like you said, it's part that these weapons are coming from the government, and also look, they're uh, just the fact that these are military guns and they're access to military equipment, that these may be some weapons that civilians or regular people may not to be able to get their hands on, and so then they could easily, I think, wind up in the black market if they're already illegal,
Right.
and they could be used as like some pretty nasty kind of crimes, the kind of things that's generated by government black markets and anything, but nonetheless there are real victims of those crimes, and so
Yeah.
that would be one of my concerns here. Well, anything else on this story?
No, I mean, I would encourage people to go read the AP write up. It's very long and detailed, and it really, I think, does the good work there. And so, like, when you hear these denials from Warmuth and Milley, like, I would, I would go read the report and see for yourself if you think that's persuasive, because their denials were not very detailed. They didn't really get into the specifics. So,
Right. All right. Well, I think the last thing we had, and this isn't something we're going to get into a lot, but I did think was worth mentioning because it was a massive story in the Trump administration, and there was a report from Politico on Friday, this past Friday, that the White House had put a temporary pause on $100 million in additional military assistance to Ukraine. But then, when asked on Friday, the White House press secretary Jen Psaki said it was nonsense. And she points out, and this was the first thing I thought, that the U.S. announced just before the Biden was traveling to Europe, which eventually ended with his summit in Putin, an additional $150 million in lethal assistance to Ukraine. So it would have been kind of odd, Will, for them to approve $150 million and then freeze $100 million. Now, the only thing that I could think that may have like provoked something was it did seem like the Ukrainian president was really trying to get NATO to overcommit by saying that, we are on our path to being NATO members, and really overplaying how much support they had for NATO membership. Biden came out and didn't say that, look, we're not trying to get NATO into Ukraine into NATO, but did clarify that we're worried about Ukraine's corruption problems. And so it didn't make it sound like Biden had any plans to actually let Ukraine into NATO in the next year or so. And so I did have a thought, well, that maybe there was a report of this around as a kind of a punishment for Ukraine stepping out of line with that statement. But again, with that, the 150 million announced so close, my thinking here is that it's just not true, and that the White House denial is accurate in that they're not planning on cutting this aid. Now I wish they would. That's an important thing
right.
to remember in all of this. I think there's terrible actors in Ukraine that these weapons could end up in the hands of neo-Nazis, but at the same time, I don't think they're cutting this, and so I don't know if somebody's trying to generate some impeachment against Biden. I think it would be pretty hard for the Democrats to pretend like there's not something wrong with Biden threatening to withhold this aid if
Yeah.
it did happen, right? Like, you're going to look like a real hypocrite to not, want to do an investigation against Biden like you did Trump. But at the same
Exactly.
time, they won't do it. So I feel like, well, this story has the possibility of getting a lot bigger, that the Republicans essentially try to turn into a Ukraine gate. And so I just want to
Right.
be out ahead of it and kind of update where everything was known is on this story. We don't know what aid they were threatening to cut. We don't know, if there was like a situation where this was supposed to be a quid pro quo, it was supposed to be a punishment for something. If, somebody showed Biden a report that said, oh boy, there's the Azov battalion boys in the Ukrainian National Guard. And let me tell you something, those guys don't like Jews. So
Yeah.
we should probably not give them money
Yeah.
and guns and stuff like that. And so it's possible that that's a part of what it was too, but there's absolutely no information on it. And my guess at this point, again, is that the story was untrue, that this was some kind of leak, and maybe somebody else trying to generate a bigger story. But Will, that's all I have on it. I don't know if you have any more details or if you've heard anything else about this.
Yeah, one thing I'll say that's interesting is just like regardless, like you listed a lot of the potential like considerations going into this or potentially what happened here. But like regardless, I do think it's an interesting thing just optics wise because of what a big scandal it was for Trump to have like the idea that he paused the aid as a quid pro quo to Zelensky. That the optics there are interesting for the Biden administration. If they do anything with Ukraine aid, like you can guarantee that the Republicans are going to be all over that. So I think they would want to say they did actually freeze it or block it or whatever, they might have a reason to deny that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that could come of that. So yeah, we'll definitely keep watching it.
All right. Well, that's where we'll wrap for today. A little bit of a shorter show today. I am traveling this week, so I actually will got Wednesday's episode all ready to go. It's a great interview with Brian Sadie. He was a early guest on the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I haven't talked to him in a couple of years. I was super excited to have him back on, and he dropped some serious knowledge about the drug war. So anybody who's interested in the drug war, like where the cocaine comes from, what the U.S. is trying to do about it, and how it factors into U.S. geopolitics, this is the episode for you. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm really excited about it.
Hell yeah.
So be sure that you're subscribed somewhere, that you're going to the Libertarian Institute every day, that you're subscribed to us on YouTube or Odyssey, that you're following us on our social media accounts. That way you get that interview and the rest of the stuff we do. Will, thanks so much, and we'll be back with another show on Wednesday.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody. See you.